Good morning, Pittman Elementary. Today we will be reading Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 of Ranger in Time. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. Miles and miles and buffalo dung. Get on now, Fergus. Get on, Jed. Pa hollered to the oxen from his horse. He and the other men rode their horses alongside the teams of oxen to keep them moving. Sam wished he were older so he could help, but all he could do was walk with Lizzie and Ma and the other women and children. Amelia rode in the wagon most of the time. When she did get out to walk, the new dog stayed close and nudged her every time she slowed down. "You're like a sheepdog, rounding everybody up." Sam reached down to pet Ranger's head, "and I wished I knew your name. I guess you can just be Dog for now." "I'm amazed that you convinced your father to keep him," Ma said. But Sam had seen Pa looking back at the farm when they'd pulled out of Boonville a week ago. They had heard Scout barking all the way down the road. Pa's eyes had been just as shiny and wet as Sam's. He missed Scout, too. Sam looked over his shoulder. An endless train of wagons stretched out behind them, all heading west. "I sure hope the Willamette Valley has as much land as they say. I don't think anyone's going to be left back east." "We could still turn around," Lizzie said, scuffing her boots in the dust. "Let everyone else run off to be taken ill and attacked by Indians." "We'll be just fine, Lizzie," Ma said. But she started humming a hymn from church. She did that when she felt anxious, Sam knew. With such a long list of bad things that could happen out on the trail, she was humming a lot these days. "Mr. Palmer says most of the Indians are friendly and just want to trade," Sam said. "He says some help with river crossings." "Well, that's good," Ma said, and her humming quieted down. Ma and Pa trusted Mr. Palmer's book. The guidebook also said that traveling in groups made the journey safer, and there were 20 wagons in the Abbott's train. Sam's family and 9 others from Missouri, all hoping to settle on better farmland out west. The Harrigans and the Middletons from Iowa had the same goal, along with Dr. Loring and his wife, plus 6 other families from Indiana. Sarah Ferguson and her parents were part of the wagon train, too. They were traveling from a place called Nauvoo, Illinois, to the Great Salt Lake, where there was a much bigger community of Mormon families, including all those cousins Sarah was so good at chasing. For now, though, Sarah spent her time helping with Amelia, and Mrs. Abbott was happy to have another older child keeping watch. Some of the men traveling alone hadn't bothered with wagons. Henry and Ezra Beard, brothers from St. Louis, only had mules. They were going to California to find gold. When it was almost time for supper, the Beard brothers rode ahead to find a camping place. When everyone else arrived, all 20 wagons pulled into a circle for the night. "Not bad for the first day. 17 miles, Mr. Ferguson called out to the group. The Fergusons had something called a road meter attached to their wagon. It used cogs and gears to record the number of times the wagon wheels went round and then turn that number to miles. Interesting. Sarah told Sam it was invented a few years ago by a couple of Mormon pioneers who got tired of counting the wagon wheels' rotations to measure distance. "Can you imagine? They tied a rag to the wheel to make it easier to count rotations," she said. 360 turns made a mile. "Probably helped pass the time," Sam said, reaching down to scratch Ranger's ears. "There wasn't much else to do while you walk along with the wagon." He was glad they were done traveling for the day. Pa unyoked the oxen for the night, and Ma let the chickens out to peck for bugs and worms in the grass. Sam and Sarah and the other children gathered wood for the fire. Then the women cooked up beans and bacon and trail bread for supper. And there's the picture. Getting ready for supper. It had been such a long day of walking, and Sam went right to sleep. even though his bed was just a couple of blankets spread under the wagon. He drifted off to the sound of horses chewing and fussing. Mr. Harrigan playing his fiddle a few wagons down, and Ranger snoring softly beside him. In the morning they had breakfast, loaded the wagons, hitched up the team of oxen, and started off again. It wasn't a fast walk, but it was long. They only stopped once during the day at noontime. Sometimes Sam ran ahead with Amelia, and Sarah helped them pick flowers for Ma and Mrs. Ferguson. Lizzie spent most of her time complaining. It was always too cold or too warm or too dusty. It was never home, and Sam understood that. He missed the farm and his relatives who'd stayed behind in Boonville. He missed Scout, but he was glad this new dog had decided to come along. It was good to have furry company, especially with Lizzie being so cranky. They made 20 miles the second day, 18 on the third, just 12 the next day because they had to wait to ferry across a stream. With so many wagons heading west, it was hours before the Abbotts had their turn. It was the longest walk Ranger had ever been on. Like going with Luke and Sadie to the park and home over and over and over without ever stopping to chase balls. Where was Luke? Ranger looked for him. Every time the Abbotts pulled into a camp for the night, every morning before they started out again. There were so many voices, so many faces, but none of them belonged to Luke. As the days went by, everyone traveled more slowly. People got sick. Some of them got better, but none at all. The smell of newly turned dirt made Ranger's fur stand up each time they passed a fresh grave. The landscape changed too. The earth was rough and sandy now, and the oxen's feet were swollen and cracked. The dust and rocks hurt Ranger's paws too, but at least he had plenty of scraps to eat. The oxen were struggling to find enough grass. Poor Ferguson and Jed, Sam said. The buffalo out here have eaten up all the grass. When they'd left Independence the second week of May, there was plenty of trees along the way. Now wood was scarce. The women had started bringing back buffalo dung for the fires instead. Buffalo chips made a fine, clean fire. They were easy to find, but no one in the Abbott's wagon train had seen an actual buffalo. At first, Lizzie said she'd never eat anything cooked over buffalo chips, but that didn't last long. Lizzie was as hungry as anyone else after a day of walking. One night in early June, the Abbotts made camp along Little Blue River. Sam was watching Amelia alone. Sarah's father wasn't feeling well, so he was busy helping her mother care for him. Lizzie and Ma had just come back to the wagon with their aprons full of buffalo chips when Sam thought he heard a rumbling. There were often thunderstorms on the prairie. He looked west, expecting to see storm clouds, but the sky was as blue as could be. You heard that? Sam asked Ranger. You hear that? Sam asked Ranger. Ranger not only heard it, he felt it in his paws. The rumbling was shaking the ground. He pawed at the dirt and pricked up his ears. You do hear that, don't you, boy? Sam squatted down next to Ranger. What is it, dog? Ranger whined. He sat up straight and sniffed the air. Amid the dust and oxen people smells, there was something new. Animal smell. Big animal smell. Ranger tipped his head and barked. There! He barked again and again. Sam tried to pet him. It's all right, dog. That's thunder far away. But Ranger pulled away and ran in circles, jumping and barking. He came back and pawed at Sam's legs. What is it, boy? What's wrong? It reminded Sam of the time Scout had gone crazy barking and jumping when their old barn caught fire. Scout had realized before anyone else that something was wrong. Pa, Sam called, come quick. Pa hurried over and Ranger jumped right up on him. What in heaven's name is the matter, dog? Ranger barked, then turned to the river. Pa stared across the water to the plains on the other side, and his eyes grew wide. He whirled around to Sam. "Find your sisters and get in the wagon. Hurry!" Then Pa turned to the rest of the men. He hollered at the top of his voice, "Circle the wagons! The buffalo are coming!" Chapter 6, Stampede. The buffalo were not only coming, they were thundering over the plains, heading for the river. If they crossed, they'd come ashore on top of the Abbotts' camp. The cattle were already fretting, stomping the dirt. The oxen tugged at their yokes. Amelia, Sam called. He found her playing with a pan of bread dough Ma had set out for Rise. Sam scooped her up in his arms and called to Lizzie, who was piling buffalo chips for the fire. "Leave that and come to the wagon. Pa says there's buffalo coming." Pa and the other men drew the wagons and livestock together. They hurried the women and children into the wagons, then took their guns and ducked behind some rocks to wait. Ma held baby Isaac close in one arm and circled the other tightly around Amelia. Ranger stayed close to her too. Lizzie leaned out the tailgate. "Won't they stop at the river?" Sam climbed over the trunks and barrels to look. The buffalo didn't stop. They stampeded over the open land, down to the riverbank, and plunged into one after another. The water churned and frothed into a boiling mud stew as the animals crossed. Soon the first beasts were climbing ashore, barreling toward the camp. They sounded like a great whooshing wind, like a storm blowing through. But instead of rain, the air was full of dust. And there are the buffalo coming in. "Oh, Lord, keep us safe," Ma whispered, and started humming her worry hymn. Pa and Mr. Harrigan fired their guns from behind the rocks, shooting into the stampede to try to scare the animals off their course. Pa's guidebook said that might work. If it didn't, Sam knew the whole camp could be destroyed. Henry and Ezra Beard stood side by side, firing into the herd, but the buffalo kept coming as if they were covered in armor. Sam watched from the wagon. His heart thumped along with all those pounding hooves in the dirt. Every time one of the men's guns exploded, Sam's breath caught in his throat. "Turn! Turn!" He willed the buffalo to change course. If they didn't, they'd stomp the wagons into splinters. Pa fired his rifle again and again. Finally, one of the buffalo stumbled and sank to the ground. The herd kept going, but the massive animals veered away from the blast of the guns. Sam felt a hot breeze as they rushed past, trampling the dry grass. When the land of the herd had thundered off into the dust, Henry Beard let out a whoop. Pa and the other men jumped from the rocks. They ran toward the buffalo they had taken down. Sam climbed down from the wagon bed. He slapped his thighs. "Come on, dog. Let's go see what they got." Take this to your father." Ma handed Pa's big hunting knife down to Sam. "Be careful." Ranger leaped from the wagon and kept close to Sam. There had been so many huge animals, the air was still full of their smell. Ranger followed Sam up to the collapsed buffalo. Its legs were crumpled underneath its great body. Its fur was matted with dust and blood. Mr. Harrigan and some of the Gold Rush boys from Missouri turned the buffalo over to expose its soft belly. "We'll eat well tonight," Pa said. He bent down to pat Ranger's head. "You heard them coming, didn't you, dog? Good thing you let loose barking when you did." Sam handed Pa his knife, and Pa split the buffalo hide from his throat all the way to its tail. Sam had to turn away, but later, after the sun had set and campfire smoke rose into the clouds, he breathed in the greasy goodness of buffalo steaks sizzling over the fire. It was first fresh meat they'd had since they set out for independence. "This is a little bit of heaven," Ma said as she bit into the steak. "It's not very tender," Lizzie complained, but she ate every last bit of the sweet, dark meat on her tin plate. Sam finished his supper too and leaned back to look at the stars. He could hear the oxen and horses snorting and shuffling. It had taken them a while to settle down. He could hear Mr. Harrigan turning his fiddle. He could hear Pa and the Beard brothers laughing as they told the story of bringing the buffalo down. Sam reached into his pocket and pulled out the quilt squares from the farmhouse and apple tree and Scout. What stories he'd have to write in his letters to everyone back home. Sam's belly was full and warm. His eyes were drooping when Sarah came running across the circle to their fire in tears. "Can you help me find Dr. Loring?" "Find?" Ranger's ears pricked up. Ma was already on her feet. "I think he had supper with the Middletons. Is it your father, Sarah?" Mr. Ferguson had been sick for 2 days now. Sarah nodded and let out a sob. "And Ma, too. It's bad. Oh, please, come quick." Oh, no. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 6. We will continue reading chapter 7. We might read a little bit more this afternoon. Hope everyone is enjoying Ranger in Time. I know that there's a lot of things going on in our book, but we will continue reading Ranger in Time. Everyone have a great day.